Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Henrik Ibsen's play A Doll's House, or The Doll's House. It gets translated both ways. So Ibsen is one of the great modern dramatists, sometimes identified as the father of modern drama, in part because of plays like A Doll's House, which tried to take a different approach to drama than what had been done before. This is a very feminist play, bearing in mind that this play premiered in 1879. So it's feminist for 1879, not necessarily feminist for 2022, but them's the breaks. This was a controversial play at the time. It's still a controversial play to a certain extent, but definitely nowhere near the way that it was in the late 19th century. So in the introduction here to the Bantam Classics, 4 great plays by Henrik Ibsen collection, it starts out, A Doll's House was not the first of Ibsen's plays to make enemies for him, but it was the first to spread his reputation as a subversive playwright abroad and arouse enmity toward him in foreign lands. Ibsen's subject was no longer local politics, as in the earlier Love's Comedy, but the miseducation and subjugation of the European middle-class woman. It's difficult to overestimate the significance and indeed the novelty of such a theme for Victorian readers and audiences. So that's the context in which this play is first performed. So we're going to talk about Ibsen's style, and we're going to talk about the feminist elements here. I'll start with Act 1, the scene description. Because one of the characteristics of Ibsen's drama is he's a realist. So the settings tend to be very realistic. They tend to be very familiar for 19th century middle class or upper middle class people. And the scenarios tend to be the kinds of things that they might encounter theoretically in the kinds of social situations they would be familiar with. So the scene for Act 1 and also for Act 2 and Act 3 is a room furnished comfortably and tastefully, but not extravagantly. At the back, a door to the right leads to the entrance hall. Another to the left leads to Helmer's study. Between the doors stands a piano. In the middle of the left-hand wall is a door, and beyond it a window. Near the window are a round table, armchairs, and a small sofa. In the right-hand wall at the farther end, another door, and on the same side, nearer the footlights, a stove, 2 easy chairs, and a rocking chair. Between the stove and the door, a small table. Engravings on the walls. A cabinet with china and other small objects. A small bookcase with well-bound books. The floors are carpeted, and a fire burns in the stove. It is winter. A bell rings in the hall. Shortly afterward, the door is heard to open. Enter Nora, humming a tune and in high spirits. She is in outdoor dress and carries a number of parcels. These she lays on the table to the right. She leaves the outer door open after her, and through it is seen a porter who is carrying a Christmas tree and a basket, which he gives to the maid who has opened the door. So the scene we have set here could be anywhere in Europe, really. Especially Western Europe, Northern Europe, in 1879. This is a very, very bourgeois, middle-class type household. So that's our first visual impression of this space. And that, of course, comes with a set of conventions about decorum, about ethics, about gender roles, etc., etc. So that's very, very significant. The way that Ibsen sets this play up and sets up a set of expectations viewers are going to have from before the first line is even spoken. That's very, very significant for the themes of this play. So the first character we get is Nora. Nora is a fairly young housewife, the wife of Torvald Helmer, and she's our protagonist of the play. Interestingly enough, almost the first thing that happens in the play is that Torvald infantilizes her. Calling out from his room, he says, "Is that my little lark twittering out there?" And then she says, "Yes, it is." And he says, "Is it my little squirrel bustling about?" So he's continually referring to her by these sort of small, cute animal names. And that's a technique that he uses, again, to infantilize her, to literally make her seem like she is not an adult person. And in 1879, that might not have been as immediately overt, but in 2022, that's quite striking, I think, that's the first impression we get of Torvald. So, the opening portion of the play, he infantilizes her, she idealizes him, and he makes it clear that he is not on board with how much money she spends, but because he is getting a big promotion, getting a job as a manager of a bank, they're going to be rolling in dough in the relatively near future, and so all of their problems are solved in both of their opinions. But he does have this bit, and I think this is important thematically because it starts to establish the conflict. He says, "That is like a woman, but seriously, Nora, you know what I think about that. No debt, no borrowing. There can be no freedom or beauty about a home life that depends on borrowing and debt. We two have kept bravely on the straight road so far, and we need to keep on the same way for the short time longer that there need be any struggle." So this is a play about economics. Home economics, but also gendered economics. Because what we come to find out, when Mrs. Linda, Nora's childhood friend, she's a widow. She had to work very hard to maintain herself financially, and she's now come to the big city to try and find better economic prospects. Nora tells Mrs. Lind that Torvald had been sick at one point. He had overworked, and he got severely ill. And the doctors said, "You must go on a vacation." Extended vacation, 6 months in the tropics of Italy, apparently. That was a very standard thing, especially for people in like Northern Europe, like Ibsen. Ibsen was from Norway. Brits, Scandinavians, people from northern Germany, etc., very often go to Italy, go to Greece, whatever it is, Mediterranean climate. So anyway, that cost a ton of money, £250, massive amount of money in 1879. How did they get it? Torvald was broke. The story that Nora told Torvald about how she got the money was that her father had just died, which was true, he did just die, and that he had left her the money. Torvald, none the wiser. But we learn that Nora did not, in fact, inherit the money from her father, who left pretty much nothing. Instead, what we find out is that she borrowed the money from this guy named Krogstad, who shows up, who works at the bank that her husband is now going to manage. Krogstad, and Nora has been paying it back. Like she secretly took out this loan without Torvald's knowledge. She's been paying Krogstad back as she can, basically by depriving herself of stuff. So like she's still buying the stuff that Torvald wants, the nice food and wine and whatever. She's buying the stuff her children needs, but she's doing without. So great, admirable, great character so far. What we find out is that Krogstad has a questionable reputation because he committed fraud to try and get money earlier in his life, and that ruined his reputation. And now that Torvald is taking over as manager of the bank. He doesn't want Krogstad working there. The problem, two problems. One is that Krogstad owns the debt that Nora owes him without Torvald's knowledge. Two is that she forged her dad's signature on that thing, on the bond, as basically security for it. The problem is she dated it very carelessly 3 days after her dad had died. So, Krogstad knows for certain that she forged that signature, and he could destroy her reputation, which would thereby destroy Torvald as well. So, Nora has to try and figure out how to navigate around this. She tries to get Torvald to agree to keep Krogstad on at the bank, but Torvald absolutely refuses to do so. Nora is unwilling to explain to him why she's so desperate to keep him on, etc., etc. So this becomes the crisis of the central portion of the play. It turns out Mrs. Linde and Krogstad have a history. They had been romantically involved, but she basically abandoned him in favor of somebody with better economic prospects because she was in a desperate financial situation, and young Krogstad didn't have any money, etc., etc. They basically get back together. It's an interesting trajectory because Krogstad is the villain for the first act and the first two. Well, he really comes in the second act more than the first act, but really throughout the first two acts, Krogstad is clearly the villain. It's in the third act, relatively early in the third act, actually, that he transitions from being the villain to being a sympathetic character. Mrs. Linde says, so Krogstad basically, when Mrs. Linde is like, hey man, let's be miserable, poor people scrabbling along together. Krogstad's like, great, that sounds awesome. I've always wanted to be married to you. And he's like, well, I got to get my letter back so I don't destroy Nora and Torvald. And she's like, no, Nils, you must not recall your letter. Krogstad says, but tell me, wasn't it for that very purpose that you asked me to meet you here? And Mrs. Linde says, in my first moment of fright, it was. But 24 hours have elapsed since then, and in that time I've witnessed incredible things in this house. Helmer must know all about it. This unhappy secret must be disclosed. They must have a complete understanding between them, which is impossible with all this concealment and falsehood going on. So Krogstad decides he wants to do the right thing. And in his writing about this play, George Bernard Shaw, who was one of the big sort of proponents of Ibsen in the UK and Ireland, pointed out that at this moment, in a traditional drama, that would have been the sort of great moment of reconciliation. The villain has repented. We could have a happy ending here, but not in Ibsen. And that's one of the things that makes this such a revolutionary style of drama that Ibsen is developing, is because he rejects that idea of what's called the well-made play, which was extremely self-contained. It had a very narrow, focused plot structure and conflict, and it was like a sitcom in a way. Like everything was wrapped up at the end. Ibsen says that's not how real life works. That's some bullshit. I'm not going to do that. So, Ibsen, rather than having Torvald get the letter back, rather than having Krogstad get the letter back and having everybody live happily ever after and ending with Krogstad and Mrs. Linde's marriage and Nora and Torvald reconciled, instead, we have a very different ending. Helmer reads the letter in which Krogstad has revealed Nora's dreadful secret, and he says to her, his first reaction is, I must try and appease him some way or another. The matter must be hushed up at all cost. And as for you and me, it must appear as if everything between us were just as before, but naturally only in the eyes of the world. You will still remain in my house, that's a matter of course, but I shall not allow you to bring up the children. I dare not trust them to you. To think that I should be obliged to say so to one whom I have loved so dearly, and whom I still... No, that is all over. From this moment, happiness is not the question. All that concerns us is to save the remains, the fragments, the appearance. So Torvald's first impulse is, you're dead to me, but because it's 1879 or whatever year the particular performance is going on, we have to maintain appearances. Then he gets another letter from Krogstad, basically saying, JK, here's the bond with Nora's debt. Hope you guys aren't too miffed. At which point, Torvald says, No, Nora, I must read it once again. Yes, it is true. I am saved, Nora. I am saved. And Nora says, and I? And Torvald says, you too, of course. We are both saved, both you and I. Interesting. Whose concerns he's really worried about. I am saved is revelatory. And Nora, who as much as everyone else in the play, with the possible exception of Dr. Rank, it's very hard to tell with him, everybody else in the play assumes and treats Nora as though she is a child, as though she's incapable of functioning in the real difficult world. And she is now overtly aware of just how deep that perception goes in her husband. Because he says a bunch more bullshit, patronizing, patriarchal, oh, you're like a little child who doesn't understand anything, and I'll teach you like our actual children, and all this fucking shit that he says. And then basically she's like, no, I'm a bounce, because what I thought was going to happen was that when Krogstad's letter revealed to you the horrible scandal that I brought on us, that you would say, I'm going to publicly take the rap for this, and I'm going to stand up against society's judgment and shit like this, and I will fall on my sword to protect my wife's honor. You did not do that. You first were like, no more children for you, but you're going to keep up appearances of our domestic middle-class bliss. Then you were like, I'm saved. My reputation is secure. That's not okay. I'm not on board with this. And she basically says, so he says, I don't understand you, referring to her sort of disappointment in him. And he said, and Nora says, no, that's just it. You don't understand me. And I've never understood you either before tonight. No, you mustn't interrupt me. You must simply listen to what I say. Torvald, this is a settling of accounts. So again, that's it. I love that line. This is a settling of accounts, or at least in this translation. I don't know what it is in Norwegian because I don't read Norwegian. But that idea of a settling of accounts ties the two major themes of the play, the economic theme with the gender roles theme. And she has this great section here where basically she says, both you and my father never treated me as a proper human being. You've treated me as a doll to play with. And so that's the whole A Doll's House thing. This is where the whole idea comes from. And then we've got these great set of things where she starts establishing that she wants to take responsibility for her own life. So she says, indeed, you were perfectly right. I'm not fit for the task. That's the task of training the children to be ethical beings. There's another task I must undertake first. I must try and educate myself. You're not the man to help me in that. I must do that for myself, and that is why I'm going to leave you now. Then she says a little while later, it's no use forbidding me anything any longer. I will take with me what belongs to me. I will take nothing from you either now or later. He says, and you don't consider what people will say? And she says, I cannot consider that at all. I only know that it is necessary for me. And so they have this discussion of sacred duties. He posits her sacred duty as a wife and mother. She posits her duty to herself. She says, I don't understand religion. I know what I've been told by priests, but I need to go out and learn for myself what this means. And she has this line here. I think, again, this is a great line. She says, I'm going to see if I can make out who is right, the world or I. And so this is the feminist conclusion of the play, or it's often read as a feminist conclusion of the play. And I think that's fair, although previous times when I've read this and seen this performed, I was really not a fan of the ending. But actually, on rereading it now, I think this is a great ending, even though Ibsen himself was apparently not set on this ending where she leaves him, because he allowed, I think it was the first German production. I think they changed the ending so that Nora and Torvald were reconciled. But I think this is actually a great ending in many ways. Like Nora, the idea of Nora going out to discover herself in a way that she cannot do under the strictures of 19th century middle class gender norms. I think it's very, very strong. And I think it's very, very compelling. And it's especially compelling because it's not a simple, cut and dried, all women should leave their husbands and go out and do whatever they need to do to discover themselves as human beings. Because we also have Mrs. Lind, who's together with Krogstad. That's her sort of source of happiness. She knows herself. She knows what she wants. She knows that she wants to work. And so it is that question, it's driven by that question of self-knowledge that I think is such a good one. And then the very last bit, this has become an iconic ending from this play. The stage directions, the sound of a door shutting is heard from below as Nora leaves.